HSC Option 2, Sport and Physical Activity in Australian Society. This is the second key idea. What is the relationship between sport, national and cultural identity? The previous recording, I tackled this first question here, so we're up to the second question for this area of the syllabus. And it's asking you to identify instances where Australia has used sport for political purposes. And then the second part of the question, evaluate the impact of this on the athletes and the Australian public. Now it's obvious that the section of the syllabus that the question wants you to write about is over here, the dash point, politics and sport. This is the question in red up here, and as I just said previously, there are two parts of this question and I'm going to answer them separately. So the first part of the question is simply for you to identify instances. So that just means give some examples where sport has been used for political purposes in this country. And then the second part of the question, the more difficult part of it, is evaluate the impact on the athlete and the Australian public when the government has used sport for political purposes. Okay, let's identify some instances where Australia has used sport for political purposes. Probably the most popular example in history was when the South African government had this political system in place called the Apartheid political system. Now what apartheid is basically racial segregation, meaning that the government at the time was trying to segregate whites from the blacks, and that was pretty much completely to the detriment of the black population. So it was the government, the white government of South Africa, that ruled and created all the economic opportunities for the white population at the expense of the blacks. It was very difficult for the black population to get any success in that country, whether it be in education or in fact sport. In the nation's sporting teams, the blacks were completely excluded of having any opportunity of representing their country. So to put that in a clear picture, for example, their rugby team, although having many talented black athletes, never had any black players playing for their country. They were excluded. They were not allowed to represent their country. And if you think about that in terms of Australian sport, what that would be like if Indigenous Australians were prevented from playing sport for their country. Now, understandably, the world as a whole was outraged by this political system in place in South Africa. And Australia's Prime Minister at the time, Bob Hawke, was very influential in instigating a sporting boycott of South Africa. Now, why this was particularly successful is just like Australia, South Africa is a nation that is obsessed with sport. And in fact, much of their identity is based around sport. As a nation, they take great pride in beating countries such as Australia and New Zealand on the rugby field. So Bob Hawke decided it would be a pretty good idea to initiate this sporting boycott. So he put some pretty significant political pressure on the Australian cricket and rugby teams in particular for not touring South Africa and not playing any competitive sport against that nation. The second example to talk about is the 1980 Moscow Olympics, where at the time Russia was at war with Afghanistan. Now, America was not happy about this. They, at this point in history, were an ally of Afghanistan and were not happy that Russia had gone to war with the country. So the US government at the time decided not to send their Olympic team to the Moscow Olympics and also put some pressure on some other nations, including Australia. Now, the Australian government did not want the Australian Olympic team to send a team to Moscow, but they didn't put a rule in place. They left it up to the individual sports and also for the athletes to make their own decision, but with some pressure from the government not to do so. So for example, it was up to the sport of athletics or the sport of swimming to decide whether they would send their teams. Now what happened is that Australia did send a team, but it was not as strong as normal. And in fact, at the opening ceremony, the Australians did not march under the Australian flag, rather they marched under the Olympic flag. So yes, Australia did send a team, but officially it was probably not a true representation of the country of Australia. So you've introduced in your question, in your answer, sorry, two instances, the sporting boycott of South Africa and also the Moscow Olympics. Now you have to evaluate, e.g. make a decision, is it right for sport to be used as a political weapon? Now, in the case of the South African sporting boycott, there is no doubt that this sporting boycott was extremely influential in bringing down the apartheid political system. So if you were to ask black South Africans, they would say without a hesitation that it was extremely successful, that in this case, the sporting boycott put some significant pressure on the South African government at the time to bring down this apartheid political system. However, in the case of the Moscow Olympics, it was considered unsuccessful. That's because Australia still in fact sent a team that was sending out mixed messages. Also, the Australian public as a whole were not happy at all that the Australian government were using their athletes in this way, because pretty much we were just supporting an American protest here. Australia really at the time didn't have such an issue against what was happening over in Afghanistan. The country felt removed from that situation, and we felt like we were just supporting an American-led political protest. So when you evaluate, you have to make a decision. Is it right for sport to be used as a political weapon? For what it's worth, in my opinion, except in the most in extreme cases, I think it's unfair for athletes to be used for political purposes. It should be an absolute last resort after all other efforts by governments have been used. So for example, I think economic sanctions should come in place before athletes are asked to be the political pawns. The question I would probably finish with there is, why should innocent athletes be used as political weapons? Why should they be impacted by governments' political purposes? Athletes devote their life to training, and for their opportunities of not to be able to compete in the Olympics to be taken away because governments want to lead a political crusade, I think is unfair on the athletes. So finally, in my opinion, it is unfair, except in the most extreme cases, such as the example was in South Africa, where a lot of other political initiatives had been put in place and tried and failed, and it was left to sport to be the last resort in terms of bringing down the apartheid political system.